Hi everyone. I hope you had a good weekend, Easter weekend. Before I start today's lecture, just one quick reminder. You got the extra credit assignment last week on Monday, and you have until today, actually, until the end of the day today, to go into the link, click the link, and complete the survey. All the instructions are in. If you have any questions or any problem, just let me know, and we can work it out. I'll collect the names from the participants later this week and make sure that all of you, everybody that decided to participate, will have the extra credit. So that's just one quick thing. Now we can move on to today's topic. All right. So today we'll complete our discussion about counterterrorism. First, quick reminder on what we had on last lecture, which was actually last Wednesday. So we discussed a lot more in detail about the different soft power instruments that are used within the counterterrorism strategy. Those tools are mostly intended to focus on persuasion and amplifying the benefits of abstaining from terrorism instead of the cost, which is the focus of the hard power instruments. So there are different categories. I talked about the economic influence tools, which are focusing on preventing financing and applying diplomatic pressure in order to stop silent support for terrorism, such as the American support for the IRA, until the beginning of the year, until the mid-2000s, something like that. Then there was the cultural and social programs, which was a second category focusing on different CVE, countering violent extremism strategies that are intended to increase inclusion and prevent a marginalized group from going into the radicalization process. There was a lot of debate about the effectiveness of those programs and difficulties in assessing them. And the main lesson from those programs was the need to design more focused programs to very specific contexts instead of very large scale programs, which are easier for governments to come up with, but are very hard to assess and test for their effectiveness. Political influence included the various conciliatory measures in order to reduce popular support and popular leaning towards support for terrorism. That was the second part that we talked about, the soft power instruments. Then I went into a little more in-depth debate about the use of drones, probably the most popular counterterrorism tools over the last years, talking about effectiveness with the study on Pakistan, and then talking about public opinion and psychological aspects. So if you have any kind of questions in that regard, you are more than welcome to email them to me, and today we'll move on. So we talked about very on different types of counterterrorism instruments. There's a large variation, the applications of those tools. Some countries are focusing on a single approach, such as either repressive or conciliatory policies. There are a couple of countries that actually rely on combination of those. Some countries implement an expanded action, such as the American response to 9/11, which culminated in, of course, the events in Afghanistan, then in Iraq, as well as some of the legislation like the Patriot Act, which was much expanded action versus the threat of terrorism. At the same time, there's other countries which prefer a more restrained in their response to terrorism, and that one of the examples for that is the call by the Norwegian Prime Minister after the attacks by Breivik in 2011 for restraint and conciliation. So that's a different approach. There can also be there may also be variations in the counterterrorism approach when the same country faces the same threat, but there's for example different administrations. So the example for that will be the Bush approach versus the Obama approach to address the threats by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So that's another differences in those approaches. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on today. All that leading to the main puzzle when you study counterterrorism, from understanding it from a political standpoint, is what can we use, how can we use those different explanations to explain those variations in the ways that countries employ counterterrorism tools. Why do some countries prefer the repressive action while others are mostly focusing on conciliatory measures? So that's probably the main questions in that regard. Now, those questions become even more pronounced when we think about the empirical evidence regarding the effectiveness of the various counterterrorism tools. The fact that indiscriminate repression tends to backfire in most cases and generate more violence because it mostly exacerbates the frequency and lethality of terror attacks. At the same time, combining discriminate repression along with different types of conciliatory actions in most cases is more effective. We can even think about unpacking even more some of those policies. So even if we look within military repression, so we can actually find more effective evidence for some of the policy tools. If we go to our discussions about the drones in Pakistan, if we use drones not for the sole action of decapitation, but also for surveillance, for intelligence operations, and for interception of communications, then suddenly the use of this tool is a lot more effective. So there's a lot of ways to think about this evidence. There's, at the same time, even though we have some evidence for effective policies, we have a lot of historical examples of countries that are using ineffective methods in their fight with terrorism. The US responds to 9/11 with the invasion to Afghanistan and then Iraq, using mostly indiscriminate military action. It only generated more terrorism over time when we look at this compared to the Gulf, this example. And there's some recent work over the last couple of years that talked about the fact that states tend to persist in using those ineffective tools, most likely indiscriminate repression, despite the fact it doesn't show a lot of effectiveness, does not lead to the outcome that the states are looking for. And that's, in a way, is a clear deviation from a strategic and rational process, which leads us to go to our main discussion here, which is using the different theoretical approaches that we have talked about earlier in the semester in order to understand those choices of counterterrorism policies. So as always, we began with the strategic approach. So this approach, just a quick reminder, views the state as the unitary actor that decides on the counterterrorism policy based on a deliberative and calculated process, and the eventual policy should be the one that maximizes the return, matches the threat. At the same time, we also talked a little bit when we talked about the strategic approach and rational choice models about the concept of bounded rationality, the fact that usually we do not really follow a full rational process of assessing all alternatives. We tend to only do a bounded aspect of this rational process and select the policies which seem the best to us, not necessarily from a maximization standpoint are the best. So that means the selected policy may not be the most effective in reality, but still at the same time, the information updating process is a rational process. Some of the ways that we can use the strategic approach to explain counterterrorism is we can think about that as a counter response to the level of the threat. So when the level of the threat increases, the degree of implementing a certain policy, such as repression policy, also exists. This kind of argument fits some of the examples from Israel's implementation of its own repressive counterterrorism policies. Some of the studies from a couple of years ago have shown that those counterterrorism policies correlate with terror attacks, an increase in terror attacks, which become also much more lethal. Now, those increases were in the days prior to the implementation of the policies, which means that when Israel saw that the extent of terrorism is more lethal and is larger, then the response was in kind, which is also more powerful. So again, this is kind of a strategic explanation for the application of certain policies. But as always, there's a lot of counter arguments to the approach to looking at the strategic explanations for some of those choices. First, there's a lot of evidence that the policy process is nothing but organized. It's not deliberate. It's not very deliberate. It's not fitting many of the rational aspects of it. And it's mostly based on a minimal understanding of the threat. it's focused a lot more on how uncertain the current events are. It's a very sloppy process. There's a lot of improvisational aspects of this process. And an additional problem with using those kinds of arguments to explain counterterrorism choices is that if we decide to focus on a degree of threat, such as I gave the example of Israel a couple of minutes ago to explain the different policy approaches, the extent of the policy approaches being implemented, there are other examples which are very harder to explain using this logic. So for example, is the face that France and the UK has faced from terrorism over the last 10 or 15 years has been pretty much the same in terms of the extent of the threat. But at the same time, their policies were very different. So France adopted a fairly harsh repressive policy, limiting privacy protection and collecting intelligence, including very harsh police operations. At the same time, the British have implemented a much more criminal justice approach in viewing terrorism as a criminal offense and not as a national security threat. So the approach, so the level of the threat for those two countries was the same. The policies that were implemented were not the same. So it's a very problematic to think about that using strategic explanations in this aspect. Now, one of the things that we can do in order to better reflect reality when we're thinking about strategic explanation, reminding you that the idea behind the rational approach is to provide a simplification of reality. So if we want to better reflect reality, one of the things that we can do is to relax that unitary actor assumption and account for the fact that domestic politics, so that's the domestic aspects of politics, matter for governments. So the question in this case is, in the vast majority of cases, terrorism is not the most significant security threat that countries face. But still, why do governments emphasize those kinds of policies? The answer is because of us, actually, because of the public. Counterterrorism threats are salient, are important to the public. And politicians, first and foremost, their number one goal is to survive in office. If they're not able to survive in office, they're not able to implement their policies. So they have to appease the public expectation. So there's some studies that came out based on strategic explanation that focus on those effects. And what they argue essentially is that governments will adopt policies that are focusing on demonstrating to the public that the government takes this threat seriously and respond to them. For example, is using metal detectors or visible actions such as fortification with barriers in public places. Now, those kinds of actions are not necessarily in reality the most effective, especially when we compare them to covert actions such as arresting terrorists, infiltration into terror organizations. So the bottom line in this case is that the governments prefer to implement visible policies, which are less optimal, because the visible policies can be seen by the public, and that satisfies the public concerns. Covert actions, which are a lot more effective against terrorism threats, are not visible to the public, so they're not providing for the political aspect of that. They cannot provide to the government any benefits at the pools. So the end result of this entire dynamic is that a government will adopt a suboptimal counterterrorism policies due to those strategic calculations. We care more about surviving in office and appeasing the public expectations. So we will implement those policies, even though at the bottom line, eventually they do not provide us the security that we should provide to the public. A related aspect of those kinds of limitation in domestic politics is the fact that the relative lack of quality self-assessment of government when they're selecting their counterterrorism policies. In many cases, those governments do not actually engage in a full rational updating process, that is taking the information from the environment, from their policies, assessing whether the policies are effective and adjusting accordingly. So no, what they're doing is a more limited version of updating, and they do not engage in a serious evaluation of their success or the effectiveness of those actions. They do not learn from that. An example for that is ignoring from a terror strategy such as provocation is really unclear, right? If the government recognizes that there is a risk that the terror organization is trying to provoke the government to overreact, then why the government still does not update its understanding of the situation and do not implement indiscriminate repression? It's still unclear if we think about this specific theoretical explanation, and it's very hard to provide clear explanation in this case. And another approach we talked about, of course, is the organizational approach. So the organizational approach, of course, focuses on the internal institutional dynamics within governments, as well as within counterterrorism agencies, and using those kinds of insights to explain what kind of counterterrorism strategies are selected. So the first aspect here is the question, what branch of the government or what branch of the security establishment is more dominant in the design of counterterrorism, terrorism policy as a whole. So if the military or police in this case, that's the main, that's the two examples, whether it's more of a military reaction to terrorism or it's more a police reaction of terrorism. The question, if we go into the organizations themselves, why do each one of those organizations want to be more effective in shaping the policy? And that comes back to the basic organizational concept we talked about, influence and survival. A government organization will promote its own view. So the military or the police or the intelligence agencies or whatever it is that, whatever agency that relates to national security will try to promote its own view at the expense of other views, even if the view that the specific agency is trying to promote is not necessarily the most optimal policy. And the main reason, because it has to be as influential as possible in order to ensure its own survival. Coming back to the point that I've mentioned early on, the fact that different agencies may be the most dominant in shaping the counterterrorism policies of a country leads to implementation of different policies. So again, coming back to the French example, which I've mentioned a few minutes ago, they tended to implement a much more harsh and aggressive policy, which is military-focused policy. That's because the military and the intelligence agencies are much more powerful in terms of shaping the counterterrorism policy in France, compared to the British example, where the police force is much more powerful. So in this case, the approach is a lot more built on a criminal justice approach and legislative actions against terrorism. So that's exactly one way to see how those different organizations shape the decision for which counterterrorism policy is implemented. Another organizational factor is interagency rivalry. And one of the main examples for that is everything that's happened within the US national security apparatus in the 1990s before 9/11. There's a couple of books and a lot of stories that describe the hostile approach that the former head of the National Security Council counterterrorism group, Richard Clarke, he talked a lot about his book, how much animosity and pushback he got from the Pentagon in the 1990s when he pushed for a very strong and aggressive counterterrorism actions against the threat of Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden. And other agencies were much less enthused to implement such policies. So this fight, this rivalry between those different agencies within the US national security complex had an effect on what policy eventually was implemented. So I'll bring the other points here to the slide. So the other organizational factor in this case is what's called SOPs. I think I mentioned that before in one of the previous lectures. SOP stands for Standard Operation Procedures. These are standards and routines that large organizations in any situation subscribe to and tend to follow. Those routines have a good purpose overall. They're intended to prevent chaos in times of crisis. Any organization facing crisis is relying on those SOPs in order to ensure that its members are able to follow very simple procedures to address those issues. But the problem, when you think about it in the context of counterterrorism threat, is when it leads to an automatic response without carefully considering how much do these different standards fit to the problem that we're facing. So the example in this case is the British Army and the conflict in Ireland. So the British government assumed when the events in Ireland began that the colonial experience offered clear guidelines for the military in order to how to operate in civilian settings. So there was no any kind of adjustment to the orders of how to operate, or even a setting of a very clear objective when it came to the threat of civilian conflict, which also involved, of course, terrorism in Ireland. One of the results of that the British Army facing those kinds of threats followed its own standard operation procedures, its own protocol for facing those kinds of threats. So the policy facing the threats from terrorism in Ireland included very aggressive actions such as home raids, imposing very severe curfews, and using aggressive crowd control measures during protests, and escalating the violence, which all of that eventually led to the very the horrific events of Bloody Sunday in 1972. So another side effect that came from that, other than all those terrible outcomes of those events in the early 1970s, is that the local terror organizations in Ireland, led by the PIRA, have gained much more popular support from the Catholic population in Northern Ireland, because they were seen as the one that defending the population that faces the attack by the British military. So this is how standard operational procedures that, again, have a very positive objective may actually lead to a negative outcomes in the context of terrorism. All right, the third approach in this case is the psychological approach. Of course, relies on individual differences in order to explain why some decision makers favor certain policies to counter terrorism versus other types of policies. And the main challenge with this approach, as always, is to identify general patterns and to have the data to test those propositions. One of the recent findings that some of the literature talked about is look at risk perceptions as shaping a counterterrorism preferences. So variations in risk aversion of leaders will shape their preferred counterterrorism tools. There's a study from a couple of years ago which compared Obama and Bush and showed that Obama was much more risk averse in his view of the risk of terrorism threats. So he tended to use drones as his primary tool of counterterrorism. In comparison, Bush was a lot more risk acceptant in this context. So he actually favored manned airstrikes using regular Air Force and Navy airplanes. So that's one way to think about how this. Now, of course, this is not the only factors that shape those kind of decisions in terms of what kind of tools to implement in counterterrorism, but that's the individual level factor in this case. Risk perception under this view, risk aversion, is based on personality traits and psychological traits, and is rooted in any individual's genetic characteristics. So again, this is a very, very individual level factor which drives eventually part of the choice for certain counterterrorism policy actions. The psychological approach also provided us some factors, some mechanisms to think about in the group context. So I talked a lot about groupthink. We can use groupthink to explain why certain counterterrorism policies are not abolished, even though they do not provide effective outcomes eventually. We can also use that to explain why groups will not spend time on the self-assessment of their own decisions, right? So why certain governments or cabinet members or groups within the government will not spend time on self-assessment of their decision. Why? Because the groupthink syndrome prevents them from that. It puts a lot of pressure to get to a consensus and reject any kind of external or dissenting opinions. Before I move on to the next slide, I just want to stop here for a minute to talk about the attendance word of the day. So for today, the attendance word is going to be camera. Camera is attendance word for today. All right, next in line is the ideological approach. We use this approach to explain this selection of certain counterterrorism policies based on the norms and the belief systems that states are following. One way to think about the variation in responses of different countries to terrorism is to think about the different views of events, big events such as 9/11 and global terrorism as a whole. So for the American example, it was seen as an act of war. For the Germans, it was seen mostly in the context of criminal action, and the Japanese saw it as a political crisis. And these variations depend on some level on the historical experience and the context that and the practices those different countries have when they're facing security threat. That's why the American response to 9/11 and global terrorism, if we think about it from ideological, from a belief system standpoint, was very different than the German one or the Japanese one. So that's one way to think about it in this context. Another way to think about it from an ideological or a belief system standpoint is to view terrorism as a symbolic form of power that should serve as a signal for any kind of change in power relations between actors. So when terrorism is implemented, it is supposed to lead to a change in the relations between different actors. When this symbolic act is based on a radical ideology, then the effect is even greater. It matters even more. So the events of 9/11 were much more symbolic, much more powerful from that standpoint compared to the attacks in New York in 1993. So when those views are seen in the American case as a significant threat, in some level, some may say maybe even an existential threat, then it should be countered with a very strong, aggressive response, in this case, overwhelming response, which is what was the American response to 9/11. So that's one way to think about that. We can also use different mechanisms which are very specific to ideological explanations or to a belief system. First is ethnocentrism. It's based on the division of the world to in and out group members, and ethnocentrism means a higher focus on the in-group, which comprises of people of the same ethnicity. Some of the research over the last 10-15 years has shown that higher degree of ethnocentrism increased the support for a more powerful response against the perpetrators and their supporters, which again represent the outgroup in this case. This is the support for a more aggressive response is based on the need to counter those substantial threats from the outgroup, from the external threat from the outgroups. And there is a very wide evidence for that in most US public opinion data since 2001. When we're measuring aspects such as ethnocentric views, we see that the more ethnocentric people tend to be much more supportive of aggressive policy facing terrorism. Another related aspect to that is authoritarianism. Those are individuals who believe in the nature of authority as central in any social political relations. It suggests support for established authority and the use of violence, as well as accepting more traditional views of social behavior. Studies use different measures for authoritarianism. Some of them include attitude toward obedience or child rearing. Overall, they show that those have higher degrees, higher scores of authoritarianism are more likely also to support offensive and repressive counterterrorism measures. So those who are more focusing on the ethnic composition of the in-group view the out-group as more threatening, and in this case, they will support a more aggressive response against the threat. Same thing for those who view authority as a very important aspect of their social relations. The structural approach focuses, of course, on domestic and international conditions and how those shape the different preferences of a government with respect to their counterterrorism policies. So as always, I will focus on the two main factors in this case. The first was state capacity. So governments who are relatively weak are more likely to employ harsh and repressive counterterrorism policies. The main reason for that, because they don't have the ability with their military power, with their intelligence operations, with their police forces to monitor and control the populations which resent them. So a lot of this is viewed as terrorism comes from within, so that's domestic terrorism. But still, governments who don't have that ability for control and monitoring of threats from their own populations will just be unable to implement selective responses, so some more selective discriminate policies. At the same time, strong and capable states have a much more robust intelligence agencies. They have a strong judicial system and effective law enforcement forces that allows them to use a much more specific counterterrorism action instead of just implementing mass repression as a counterterrorism tool. We can think about two examples that contrast each other in this case. So Peru, a much weaker country, has implemented a policy of mass repression against the population as part of its campaign to fight against the Shining Path terror movement. Compare that to the Spanish terrorism policy, counterterrorism policy, when it faced the threat from the Basque group, the ETA group, focusing on a judicial process, providing rights to the prisoners, and the perpetrators as part of their struggle, again, against those terrorism threats. Again, this is a much more selective and discriminate types of tools which are used against terrorism compared to the example from Peru. So that's the state capacity factor. Regime type is a critical factor for explaining support for oppressive policies or torture as part of those policies. We talked a little bit about torture. So facing transnational terrorism threats, democracies are countries are a type of regime which are actually more likely to employ torture on different levels. And the explanation for that is that in those kinds of countries, the military has relative autonomy in terms of addressing external national security threats. So if the military has more autonomy and is less dependent on the directives of the leader, then it's more likely to implement torture when it's investigating terror perpetrators or terror suspects. At the same time, the public will also accept this kind of torture, but more when it comes to implementing these policies against foreign terrorists compared to domestic terrorists. And you remember we talked about that a little bit when I talked about the Piazza study that talked about the psychological effects of terrorism. So there was more support for using different types. It wasn't exactly torture, but it was different types of more aggressive interrogation techniques against those who were viewed as external, as Islamic, compared to domestic terrorism. Despite all that, we still have to remember that democracies are based on systems of checks and balances, and the public does care overall. So democracies are more constrained in the application of overall repressive policies and not very specific ones. So torture is a very specific type of repressive action for a very specific subgroup of terror perpetrators or terror suspects, which were already captured. From the aspect of overall implementation of a repressive, mass repressive policy is much harder in a democracies because of the way that the regime is built. One related aspect to regime type in this theoretical explanation is thinking about threat perception and similarity in geopolitical views and some geopolitical characteristics. So countries which have fairly similar geopolitical views, and they also have a lot of similar geographic characteristics, tend to view the perception of the threat perception from terrorism relatively similar. And what the outcome in this case, those countries tend to cluster themselves into those groups that implement the same types of policies. So for example, those who have relatively low terrorism threat perception, such as you can see the example here, Austria, Denmark, Greece, some of them are closer from a geographical standpoint. New Zealand is not very close, but they tend to implement certain types of tools. Those who view mid-level threat, such as those in the Central Europe, France, Spain, Germany, tend to also implement a policy which is kind of a mid-level with restrictions and some offensive and aggressive actions. And the top level, in this case, the group is the Americans and the British, which have very similar geographical, geopolitical views, and they view the threat similarly, so their policies are relatively very close to one another. Some aspects of the policies, at least. The final approach that we have mentioned, of course, is the critical approach. So the critical terrorism studies focus on describing counterterrorism as a function of politics, a tool by the government that is intended to manipulate the public and just further consolidate the power of the government and maintain the status quo. So it's mostly a performative act. It does not have the intention of securing the state, and it's actually using legitimate tools of military force and police force in order, again, to secure their consolidated power facing the threat of terrorism. Despite those arguments, which again, coming back and remind you again, everything that I've talked about, the problems with the critical approach, there's a lot of empirical approaches. So all the other approaches which are not the critical approach, which talk about the normative and the moral implications of implementing different counterterrorism tools. So this is part of the research. It's just not mentioned as much as maybe some of the critical scholars would like. And most of those empirical studies point to the trade-off that counterterrorism requires. I've talked about national security versus civil liberties. So this is probably the most important or the main trade-off that involves in implementing different policies, more aggressive policies. And what does that mean? And what are we giving up in exchange to gaining more national security in this case? Right, so that's that's the end of the discussion about counterterrorism. So we've had 3 different lectures about that. It's a very large topic that involves a lot of research. If you have any questions, of course, you're more than welcome to let me know. I remind you once again, if you haven't listened at the top of this video, that the extra credit assignment, the survey, is due by the end of today. So please make sure that you complete that so you can make the extra point. And I will see you all later this week. Goodbye.